Hello, welcome to BEH 215, Behavioral Health Case Management. Today we're going to talk about behavioral health and nonprofit environments. So when we're talking about managing social problems, we have to look at the approaches that are used, and they tend to fall into one or more of several categories. Prevention, which includes efforts to prevent the problem from continuing to occur. Social care, which includes custodial services designed to maximize individual potential. Social control, which includes efforts to stop and/or punish deviance. Deviance being that concept of differing from what is considered normal behavior. Rehabilitation, making beneficial changes for individuals. And social change, changing the society that created the problem. So when you think about the civil rights movement of the 1960s, they created a movement where social change was their primary motivation to bring more equity to the society in which African Americans lived. In the 1970s, you saw social change occurring for women, where equality and equity was becoming the dominant feature. So historically, social change is a large part of what we see in how the way society evolves. So, the goals of an organization greatly affect the role of its managers and many of the activities that occur within the organization. A researcher who studied Norwegian manufacturing provided a concept that is still useful today in understanding the effect of external influences on behavioral health management. William Dill identified those parts of an organization's environment that are relevant or potentially relevant to goal setting and goal attainment. He referred to these as an organization's task environment. An organization is believed to be more or less successful in its goal achievement based largely on its capacity to successfully manage its task environment. So what we're looking at here is one's goal is driven by the environment in which it's working. The task environment of a human service organization consists of any persons, organizations, or groups on whom it relies on for goal achievement and who have the potential to support or to interfere with its efforts to achieve its goals. Many of these are its stakeholders, a term that in simple terms refers to these individuals or groups who have a stake or interest or an investment in the organization and what occurs within it. One of the largest organizations in the United States is the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And under that particular umbrella organization, you see that there are several other smaller organizations that fall below it. One of the most popular perceptions is that the general public is a stakeholder, and it is not only involved as potential clients in terms of how we see clients being involved in things like the CDC or other health and human services organizations. Some people come voluntarily and appreciate the help. So there's an entire organization devoted to drug addiction. However, many others come involuntarily, sometimes court-ordered to seek help, and they are not so happy about it. So the general public as a stakeholder, sometimes they really appreciate it, sometimes not so much. Furthermore, many people who are part of the general public will never use many human services, such as income maintenance or child protection, but they pay for them anyway, and they don't like it. So how are we paying for it? Through our taxes. And when we pay for things through our taxes, we don't really get a choice on what we're spending the money on. So, for example, If you pay 15% of your income in federal tax, you don't get to say, well, I'd like 10% of that to go to defense and 5% to go to maintaining infrastructure. The Congress sets up those budgets. So as a consequence, some people are enthusiastic about their money being used for services like this, and other people are not so enthusiastic. Human service organizations, based primarily on their missions, goals, and objectives, operate in a task environment where some of its components are likely to be perceived as friendly while others are perceived as hostile. So, for example, a friendly task environment where clients get support for goal achievement include adoption agencies, hospice, job training organizations. Hostile environments is when a client resents at least some of the organization's activities and support for its goal achievements. So anyone who has ever been in the criminal justice system or the correctional facility or child protective services had to deal with that. This is where you see people who are pretty hostile about being involved in these organizations. Characteristics of a friendly task environment include: their services cost the taxpayer little or nothing. Their services are seen as desirable, that is, consistent with the society's predominant values. Their services are those that most people can envision that they or someone they care about may need to use someday. And finally, there is a general consensus that the approach to address a problem is the correct one. That is, their mission has been endorsed as legitimate by their task environment. So, for example, job training, which has a very small piece of the budget, but has extremely positive results. So if you take someone who has been relying on welfare and you put them through a 6-month training program where then they can then go work as a welder or some other job, they are going to really benefit and be able to contribute back to society through their tax-paying opportunities. Again, hospice is another option where many of us will probably end up using these services when it is our time to go to the great classroom in the sky. So another example would be a private adoption agency with a favorable task environment. The costs are borne by those who seek the service, and taxpayers contribute nothing. Finally, there is a general, if not universal, consensus that adoption is a good solution for abused or abandoned children or for children of unwanted pregnancies. So, when we look at a friendly task environment, we see a organization that provides a good service based on society's expectations that cost the taxpayers very little or nothing at all, and that meet the values of our country. Now, a hostile task environment is a much different situation, and it can be very difficult to manage in this environment. Managers at whatever administrative level involved with a financial assistance program, such as temporary assistance for needy families, which is also known as welfare, almost certainly encounter a hostile task environment because they are giving funds to persons who are not gainfully employed or who are underemployed and who are also victims of public stereotyping that assumes that they are unwilling to work, sexually promiscuous, dishonest, etc. A large number of Americans would probably vote to discontinue public assistance altogether if a public referendum were to be held. The clients often bear resentment towards the organization and the staff members who are seeking to help them. This only serves to make the general public more hostile. Interestingly, what you generally see is in the South of the United States particularly, you get a lot of poor Caucasian people who are using food stamps, who are using welfare to subsist because there are no jobs in their areas and they don't want to move to another location. But these are the same people who really do not like using these services and will vote against it by their vote for certain congressmen or senators or president. And what they're ultimately doing is voting against the programs that ultimately help them the most. What has happened over the last 40 or 50 years is that we have created this stereotype of the welfare queen who has 19 kids and lives in the ghetto and is African American and drives a Cadillac and is sucking the tit of the government. And that's really just not the case. Those are anecdotal situations that, yes, people do work the system, but the vast majority of people who are using these systems are using them because they're desperately in need. Ultimately, what happens is it leads to the perception that the organization is poorly managed, because the people who actually use the system don't like being on the system either. Other human service organizations, while receiving widespread social support on the surface, operate in a task environment that may not be much friendlier. For example, while the deinstitutionalization of people with developmental disabilities is acknowledged as a worthwhile endeavor, the general public rarely welcomes them into their community when a group home is proposed. When group homes are proposed, people freak out. They do not want group homes in their neighborhoods, and this is when you see communities come together to work against a group home. Programs engaged in refugee resettlement often encounter resistance, especially when working with populations from the Middle East or certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Part of this is because of religious stereotyping may be used to support a belief that they are all potential terrorists. Keeping in mind that there are almost 2 billion Muslims in the world, and there's a few hundred who are actually terrorists. It's the same thing with saying that all Christians are terrorists. Yes, there have been a few terrorists who have a Christian faith, but they're not all terrorists. And we have to get away from our sweeping generalizations that do no one any good. Responses of not in our neighborhood or not taking our jobs are common. We hear this a lot with the Mexican laborers who come in over the border and come in to pick fruit. The problem is they're not taking the good jobs, they're taking the jobs that most people don't want. Picking fruit is backbreaking labor. And what you'll hear a lot of the farmers say is they can't get Americans to take these jobs. So there is a conundrum in this country. And the fact of the matter is that it is these giant corporations that move their manufacturing plants off to China or India or Malaysia that have moved the jobs out of this country. It's not the Mexicans who come in over the border to pick fruit that are stealing everyone's jobs. So, what is the main difference in managing a hostile versus friendly task environment? Well, management activities that occupy the time of social workers and organizations involved in services such as public assistance, deinstitutionalization, criminal justice, refugee resettlement, and child protection are devoted to buffering out or in some other way protecting the organization from its hostile task environment. Whereas human service organizations that possess a relatively friendly task environment can focus much of their energies on working to improve the quality of services offered or on other tasks of management. Managers can focus on doing what is necessary to facilitate the flow of work and services in the most efficient and effective ways. So, working in a hostile task environment, you're dealing with a lot of issues in terms of keeping people motivated, keeping them on task, whereas in a friendly task environment you can really focus on the services themselves and how to manage those tasks efficiently. One of the main challenges of managing in a hostile task environment is managing the staff, because this environment promotes a sense of uncertainty within an organization. No one can work well in an organization whose task environment is constantly waiting, watching for a mistake or a sign of weakness to occur. So this is some information from the Oregon Center for Public Policy, and it is based on the cuts that the health services people are proposing. So of the complete health services, Division of Health Services, welfare takes up 5% of the budget. But they're looking to cut from that 5% 41% of their funding. So if you work in the welfare organization, you're looking at your already small budget getting even smaller. And this is one of those situations where, because the general public stereotypes people who are on welfare, we see this is where they're going to cut, because the public doesn't have a good opinion unless you actually have to be on welfare. Interestingly, welfare was initially developed after World War I because so many men were killed in the war, and the government felt it was more important for women to stay home and raise their children to avoid raising a generation of criminals and reprobates. And yeah, it worked out pretty well for them, but apparently we don't care about that much anymore. Now, how do we combat a hostile task environment? One of the first things we look at is acquiring prestige. While a reputation for first-class services, and that's what prestige means, may be a less attainable goal for a public social services organization, this is one way that an organization can increase its power over a hostile task environment, specifically through its management practices. An organization that exerts considerable control over its employees and their activities and is financially accountable for the funding that it receives will face less hostility from its task environment, especially the general public, than one will that has a reputation for poor management. So, one of the interesting things that has evolved over the years is, in the 1970s, if you were an alcoholic, you were basically seen as a loser and a scumbag. Well, the president's wife, Gerald Ford's wife, came out as an alcoholic, and she went to rehab, and eventually she became the face of recovering alcoholics, and the clinic was renamed the Betty Ford Clinic. And it changed a lot of people's opinions about what alcoholism was and who suffered from it. It wasn't the bums out on Skid Row. It was middle class, upper middle class, and wealthy people who were dealing with these diseases. And, so you have opportunities to acquire prestige, and however you can do it, it will help in combating that hostile task environment. Another option is called contracting, and this is a common form used by some human service organizations today, and it's called employee assistance programs, and a lot of big companies have these, and they are basically an organization such as Family Services agree to provide a specified number of hours of family counseling, counseling for substance abuse, marriage counseling, or intervention with some other problem that may be affecting the job performance of employees of a business or industry. In turn, the human service organization is given an agreed upon amount of money. This organization is also guaranteed a sizable number of fee-for-service clients, a source of both guaranteed client input and of funding. So what you're doing here is you have a social services organization and you contract out with a large company. Let's say you contract out with McDonald's. And part of that is for those people who work full-time at McDonald's, they can get counseling and substance abuse counseling, marriage counseling, all of that kind of fun stuff with this one company. And this contract then allows the company the financial security and the marketing security of knowing that they have this solid contract in place. This does little or nothing to reduce the hostility of the general public towards programs and organizations that are viewed as undesirable or that serve clients perceived as unworthy, but it does ensure funding, and it does help with keeping employees motivated. One of the hard things about managing in any environment is keeping your employees motivated. And if you can keep them excited and motivated to do their jobs, they will find a way to manage, no matter how hostile people may be to them. Co-opting involves bringing a potentially hostile representative of the task environment into the organization, giving it partial ownership. The assumption is that if the boundary lines between the organization and its environment can become more blurred by giving the task environment more input into its operation, hostility will dissipate. Placing an opponent of an organization and its programs and services in a position of influence sometimes can be an effective way to create a friendlier task environment. So, for example, you put a community member on the board of trustees for a group home for developmentally disabled adults may help them see the value to the community. People are afraid of what they don't understand. And if you can bring in community members and help them understand what they're seeing, this will benefit them in the long run. However, it can also be very dangerous. It entails giving power to someone who may just refuse to see the good the organization does, and who may use the position to cause more harm to the organization than would have been possible as an outsider. A lot of school districts have seen this occur. Somebody comes onto the school board who is a vocal opponent of a school system, and what they do, instead of getting on board and understanding the challenges that the school system is facing, is they work to undermine the school district at every possible turn. So, buyer beware, in other words. There are caveats to all of these. Other ways to increase control over the task environment include alternatives and diversification. In human service organizations, this might be the development of a variety of different client referral sources and networks, especially non-traditional ones such as sororities and fraternities or club sports organizations for adolescents. A lot of times, the people who are experimenting with drugs and alcohol and unsafe sex are young people. And the best way to get to them is where they are hanging out. And so it may seem odd that an organization would partner with a fraternity or sorority, but it makes perfect sense when you look at their mission. This can help create more certainty and leave themselves less vulnerable to a reduced need for services if they were to offer a variety of programs and services. It is hoped that some of these would generate wide public acceptance and would also carry the organization if support for other programs and services lose funding or have to be discontinued. So, for example, back in the 80s, when AIDS first was recognized by the medical community, there weren't a lot of options out there for people who wanted to get tested. By the 90s, a lot of organizations were offering testing in addition to other services, and it brought in a lot of gay men. It brought in a lot of people who used intravenous drugs to have health checks in addition to getting tested for HIV or AIDS. So they diversified their health options and also focused on a particular health issue of this community. A pitfall of over-diversification could result in the loss of prestige. And again, it depends on, what the prestige is. The American Red Cross, for example, has fought a battle with their level of prestige because they've collected a heck of a lot of money over the years, but they don't spend a lot of money. And they've been battling that issue. But they are the #1 organization out there to collect blood and distribute it in times of emergencies. Coalescing can be an extremely costly method of increasing control over a hostile task environment. It is often the last resort tactic of survival. In practice, the environment, often the competition, is brought in and shares in the operations, often through a friendly takeover or merger. Autonomy, jobs, and influence of certain individuals generally suffer. While relatively rare in human services, coalescing does occur. So if you're running a small drug rehab and the costs are so high and you don't have very good administrative practices, you may be offered an opportunity to be bought out by a larger rehab organization. You would be kept on as the manager, but you would lose the autonomy that you have been owning as the owner of this rehab. So there are some issues that go along with coalescing. So let's look at the differences now between the behavioral health profession and traditional businesses. Efficiency being a big one. We talked about efficiency last week in the previous chapter. A traditional business exists to make profit. Consequently, it is efficiency driven. Human service organizations cannot ignore efficiency, but it is not their only focus. They must also pay the utility bills, the salaries, and address other fiscal issues. But primarily, they must meet ethical obligations to provide quality client services to people in need of help and to consider the human impact of any decisions that they make. They cannot afford to develop a reputation for being overly preoccupied with efficiency, or in the case of certain organizations with profit, at the expense of fairness or what is right. So when you look at a nonprofit, one of the things that you can do to measure how good a nonprofit is how do they use their funds. And if you look on the right-hand side, here is an organization where 88% of the money that they collect goes to their programs. And then the programs are listed on the left. Administrative support is about 11% and fund development is 7.7%. What is fund development? That's fundraising. So this is a great organization. There are other organizations where literally they might have a completely different proportion, where program services might be 10% and administrative support 20% and fund development 70%. They spent most of their money raising money for 10% programs. So that's how you can assess whether or not a nonprofit is a good business model. The decision to discontinue a service that is costly and represents a financial drain on resources will sometimes have to be made, but not without a good deal of soul-searching and justifying, not usually required in a traditional business. Sometimes, for professional and ethical reasons, a human service organization will choose to do what a traditional business would rarely, if ever, do, which is operate at a loss. Now, no organization can do this on a consistent basis and continue to exist unless they have other sources of funding. Client needs, social responsibility, fairness, and professional ethics often dictate more loudly to behavioral health managers than do the demands for efficiency, or at least they should. Balancing the needs of the organization often leaves managers feeling as if they are in a no-win situation. Managers are vulnerable to criticism whether they opt for efficiency or for equity, and equity being fairness. Another major difference is customer loyalty. In a traditional business, they actively court the loyalty of its customers. You get a loyalty card, you get emails, hey, come on in, you're a great customer. The goal is to have repeat customers who buy the products again and will accept no other substitute. However, in contrast, professionals within the human service organizations do not necessarily want client loyalty. While a traditional business sees loyalty in the form of repeat sales as an indicator of success, behavioral healthcare workers are more likely to see client dependency and the repeated return of clients for more help as a clear warning that their services are not working and the goals are not being achieved. So, you don't promote dependency among clients. Behavioral health care organizations lack the predictable market for their product. However, given the professional values, it cannot be any other way. So if you're running a rehab, you don't want people to fail. You want them to be successful. You want them to stay off drugs and alcohol. And if they fail and they return, there is this feeling that it is also your failure. Another issue is competition. Historically, competition has been less important for human service organizations, once again, except those in the for-profit sector and certain healthcare providers. Client waiting lists and service gaps, which no one organization could fill, were often more typical of many human service organizations. People who are on the waiting list for Section 8 housing, which is subsidized housing, can be on the list for years before they can get housing. So, it is a issue of not enough opportunity or funding and too much demand. Today, in most human service organizations, there is stiff competition for external funding. Developing efficient referral networks and implementing inter-office coordination remain important management activities. So if you look at how community service gets their grant money, 32% of monies go to child welfare and youth at risk. Children, we all kind of look at children as that future, so we're going to give money to them. Elderly adults, 10%. Counseling and support, 9%. So we're not looking necessarily at those adults who may have issues with their problems, with sexual abuse, but we look at children, we look at the elderly as being people that really need the help. An increasing amount of time of higher level managers is now devoted to attempting to successfully compete with other organizations for funding from private foundations or organizations such as the United Way. Managers should be able to write grant proposals for programs that will get funded, and then they will manage the programs well so they can be successful and will continue to be funded. So, when we are looking at these nonprofits, they're not just sitting back waiting for money to roll in. The people who work up at the top of those charts are the people who are out there hustling, looking for the money, writing the grant proposals, making sure that the funding is in place year after year. Another difference is marketing. Competition naturally increases the need for good marketing. Both businesses and behavioral service organizations seek out potential customers and clients and seek to enhance their visibility and their reputations through some sort of advertisement. Human service organizations often conduct needs assessments before they offer a program or service. If a behavioral health organization sees that a large number of potential clients exist, they will likely offer the service if sufficient funding is available. But they may occasionally offer the service even if only a relatively few potential clients indicate a need for it. The ethical necessity of addressing a problem takes precedence over efficiency. So this is a very different concept than in a regular business. So if you have someone who is suffering from a disease that is not, something that everybody, 10% of the population has, if it's 1 in 1,000, it is still incumbent upon this human services organization to try and provide services so that this population can be served. Another major difference is available cause and effect knowledge. A manufacturing plant is likely to have many of its employees engaged in tasks that have found to be the most efficient. Moreover, the business may be able to accurately adjust their budget based on past sales and predict with reasonable accuracy what future sales of the item will be. Now, just to put this in context, Toyota, the manufacturer of the Japanese cars, they have done studies where they can literally tell you how long it should take to put each piece of the car together. And based on those projections, they can say with certainty how long it'll take to manufacture the car and when certain pieces of inventory need to be moved onto the manufacturing floor. So, this idea of predictability is very helpful in this environment because they are working within a reasonable certainty of what is going to happen. No comparable level of knowledge exists in many areas of behavioral health services. Cause and effect knowledge is simply not available for many forms of practice of the complexity of human behavior that is involved. Anyone who has dealt with a broken heart will tell you that it's never easy, and there's no one way to get over a love affair, or when you're angry at your boss, or you're mad about something else that has happened with your family. People react differently. Some people shut down, some people go into a rage, some people disappear for a while. It is unique to the situation and to the person, so there's no one way of doing it. While research has produced evidence of best practices in many areas of services, behavioral health managers often cannot know with certainty what is the right, or i.e. effective, way to intervene with a specific client or client group. The only thing supervisors can do is nurture a work climate conducive to the exercise of professional judgment and discretion, one in which some risk-taking is perceived as necessary and desirable. And again, last week we talked about how perspective and experience helps us become better at our jobs. And again, in this particular situation, when we work with clients, we may not have met this particular person before, but certain behavioral characteristics will be familiar and will help us identify what we need to do to facilitate a more productive experience for them. Another issue is the interaction with the consumer. An organization that sells a product or service to the consumers only face the consumer when they are considering buying the product or service. Generally, the consumer seeks out the product, and after the sale, the consumer will provide feedback on their experience. Consumer interaction and feedback in human service organizations is usually different. It tends to be more direct, face-to-face, and often frequent. In human service organizations, social workers who offer direct services often cannot know if they are being successful until months or years after the service is provided. The manager's role is to document whether or not services and programs have been successful. Lacking clear indicators, any conclusions must be regarded as tentative and are arrived at from a variety of evaluation criteria that are often more qualitative. So, in a particular scenario of, if somebody is learning the activities of daily life, if they're developmentally disabled, can they tie their shoes? Can they brush their own teeth? Can they take a shower? Can they bathe themselves? These evaluation criteria may seem fairly simplistic, but for somebody who is an adult but has the mind of a 5-year-old, these are great strides in their behavior. Also, we have the difference in the prime beneficiary. One more difference is this idea. In their classic 1962 study of public social agencies, Blau and Scott first introduced the concept of prime beneficiary. They identified 4 categories of individuals as potential beneficiaries of any formal organization: its members, its owners, its customers, and the public at large. And a little cartoon over there. Do you remember when all we had to worry about was client care? Well, this is the issue, is that nowadays you have to worry about everyone and everything. While more than one of these groups may benefit from an organization's activities, Blau and Scott suggest that there is or should be only one primary beneficiary for a social services organization. Any benefits that accrue to other beneficiaries are viewed as costs, since they usually result in fewer benefits for the prime beneficiary. The position is clearly stated in Standard 1.01 of the NASW Code of Ethics. It reads, "Social workers' primary responsibility is to promote the well-being of clients. In general, clients' interests are primary." However, the words "in general" open the door to exceptions. The issue of who is our prime beneficiary can be a source of ethical conflicts for managers. The needs and wishes of other beneficiaries of the task environment cannot be ignored. Consequently, much of a manager's time may be spent in trying to find ways to better address client needs, while also attempting to satisfy the demands of other groups and individuals who may believe and often act as if each is a prime beneficiary. Managers are confronted almost daily with the need to satisfy different and sometimes competing values and stakeholder interests. Often the competition for the role of prime beneficiary is between clients and the public at large. And we go back to this idea of welfare, where the public may see it as, wasting money, and the clients see it as the only way they're able to survive. Especially in the public sector, a behavioral health manager may face an ongoing battle to attempt to gain acceptance for the client as the prime beneficiary. Members of the public at large, because they contribute money through the tax structure to fund these organizations, often believe, logically enough, that they should be the prime beneficiary. In those human service organizations that receive primary funding from private donations, members of the public who make those donations are likely to act as if they are the prime beneficiary and will demand a say in how, when, where, and even what kind of services will be delivered. Now, every few years you'll see that some organization had some major event in New York or Los Angeles to support, kids with cancer, or the Make-A-Wish Foundation, and it costs some extraordinary amount of money to put this on, and they're having filet mignon and lobster and all of this stuff, and you're like, well, why don't they just donate the money and save the money for the banquet? And that's the issue, is that the people who are making the donations want to be celebrated for their donation, and by giving them a party, that is their opportunity to be the prime beneficiary and have a say in what is done. The concept of prime beneficiary is helpful in understanding the feeling of being caught in the middle that a behavioral health care manager often experiences. If you please one group, you are almost certain to displease another. Managers in most human service organizations where there is a lack of consensus as to the prime beneficiary often attempt to serve two masters, sometimes even more. And we have learned through life experience that you cannot serve two masters, which means they often face frequent ethical issues and challenges. They may also lack job security, since they invariably upset one group or another. So let's talk about nonprofit organizations. And this is a special type of organization that is also called not-for-profit, that differs in important ways from, for example, the public social agency often associated with human services, which is a governmental agency. Nonprofit organizations can generate a cash surplus if they do not do it consistently, i.e., they take in more money than they spend. However, the surplus must go back into the organization's benefits, reserves, expansion, and so on, or the organization risks losing its nonprofit status and the benefits that go with it. They attempt to show neither a loss nor a profit at the end of each business year. And here's some examples of nonprofits. You have the American Cancer Society, the World Wildlife Fund, the Boys and Girls Club of America, the ASPCA, Blue Star Families, UNICEF, and this college, the Pennsylvania Institute of Technology, is also a nonprofit. The issue is not how much or where money is made and where it flows, but where it ends up. If the nonprofit organization is a public charity, money should end up in services to the public. If it is a political organization, to services and lobbying within special limits and so forth. If the nonprofit organization is a think tank, money goes to academic-like resources, new hires, publications, and so forth. A critical indicator of the viability of nonprofit organization is its cash reserves. Reserves are necessary for any nonprofit organization in order to weather economic downturns. When there is a recession or the stock market crashes, people stop making donations. So you have to be able to manage to, that bridge of time where people are keeping their wallets closed. The majority of nonprofit organizations operate virtually from month to month financially. Types of nonprofit organizations include membership or non-membership, trade association, charities, think tanks, and political advocacy organizations, and each is managed differently. Some nonprofit organizations register one or more of their employees as lobbyists, a term for persons representing the organization who formally declare that they intend to influence the laws and policies made by the legislature. So, for example, AARP is the United States' largest nonprofit organization with over 40 million members. That is about 14% of the population in this country. It is part insurance company, making itself available to members only, and part membership organization. It is also one of the nation's strongest lobbying groups for many issues that affect older Americans. Sorry about that typo. Including health care and Social Security benefits. Managers and other staff members within nonprofit organizations have the freedom to advocate for issues that the government employees usually do not have. An experienced lobbyist can introduce behavioral health workers to lawmakers and policymakers in the state capitol. A second method is to email, text, or call members of or donors to the organization and ask them to contact lawmakers concerning issues of importance. Lawmakers not only vote positively or negatively on an issue, but they also control the funding in many cases. So, a lot of what gets done in a nonprofit environment is trying to influence those who have the money. And that can include the government as well as private donations. So the manager really gets involved in a lot of these issues, and it's not so much working with the clients like you do when you're first starting out. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email or text. And if you are not in my class, please feel free to leave a comment, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you very much, and have a terrific day.